In my line of work, you trust your gut. A gut feeling can save your life. Mine told me something was wrong at home. My name is Dean Lawson, 52 years old. Ex-Special Forces, now running my own private security firm. I don't take orders anymore. I give them. Years in the field taught me that control is everything. You control the variables, you control the outcome. That's how I built my business, how I built my life. So when things started to feel off at home, I didn't ignore it. I investigated. Lorraine and I had been married for over 20 years. She used to be sharp, calculated, the kind of woman who knew how to play her cards right. That's what I respected about her. But lately, she'd been different. Distracted. Smiling at texts she didn't bother to hide. Working late when she never used to. A new perfume, subtle but distinct. One night, she came home later than usual. She walked in, tossed her bag on the counter, and gave me a casual, "Hey." I looked up from my laptop. "Work late again?" She kicked off her heels, not meeting my eyes. "Yeah, meeting ran over. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was. Meetings don't run over at the same time. Every time, 3 nights in a row. I nodded, let it go. Didn't ask any more questions because I already had my answer. When people lie, they fill the silence. Lorraine used to be good at deception. Now she was getting sloppy. That night, while she slept, I got to work. Installed a tracker in her car, discreet, untraceable. Checked the home security footage for any irregularities. Logged into our shared bank account. Took note of any unexplained transactions. Nothing major, she wasn't stupid. But I found small things. Restaurant charges at places I knew she'd never pick for a work meeting. Over the next few days, the pattern became clear. She wasn't just meeting someone. She was strategic about it. She wasn't careless, just arrogant. Thought I wouldn't notice. Thought she had control. I let her think that. The first solid lead came from our neighbor, Mrs. Garrison. She'd lived on this street since before I moved in. The kind of old woman who watched everything from behind her lace curtains. She stopped me as I was heading to my truck one morning, leaning on her cane, wrapped in one of those knit shawls she always wore. "Dean," she said, her voice slow and deliberate. "I saw a man at your house the other day. Not a friend of yours, I take it." I turned, gave her my full attention. "What did he look like?" "Tall, well-dressed. Drove a fancy car, one of those foreign ones. Showed up when Lorraine was home alone." She paused, eyes narrowing. "Didn't stay too long." I nodded. "Appreciate you telling me, Mrs. Garrison." She pursed her lips, like she was debating whether to say more. "You always seemed like a man who sees things for what they are," she finally said. "Just thought you should know." I gave her a small nod and got in my truck. Didn't react, didn't show a damn thing. Just drove to work, my mind already running the next phase of the operation. That night, I checked the GPS tracker. Her car had been at an upscale hotel downtown. 2 hours, then straight home. I sat back, exhaled slowly. So that's how she wanted to play it. Fine. I played to win. The next morning, I made breakfast like I always did. Coffee black, eggs over easy, 2 slices of toast. Lorraine walked in wearing one of those tailored blouses she always wore to work, hair pinned up, makeup flawless. She was good at appearances, I'd give her that. "Smells good," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Didn't hear you come to bed last night." I took a bite of my toast, let the silence stretch just long enough. Had some work to finish. She nodded, sipping her coffee like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Anything interesting?" "Nothing I can't handle." I watched her reaction, saw the slight shift in her expression before she hit it. Not fear, not guilt, calculation. She was measuring my words, reading between the lines, just like I was reading her. She grabbed her purse, checked her phone. I'd bet money on it being him. "Gotta run. Early meeting." "You have a good day, Dean." I just nodded. She walked out the door, and I heard her car pull out of the driveway a minute later. I picked up my phone, opened the tracking app. She was headed toward the same hotel. The game had officially started. I took the day off, told my second-in-command, Reese, to handle operations at the firm. "Need to take care of something personal," I told him. Reese was former military like me, didn't ask questions when he knew I wasn't in the mood to answer them. I parked a few blocks from the hotel and waited. An hour later, Lorraine's car was still in the lot. A sleek black Audi pulled up, and a man stepped out, tall, mid-40s, expensive suit. He walked inside without hesitation. I sat there, watching the entrance, my mind running through every possible move. I didn't let emotion get in the way. This wasn't about anger or betrayal. This was about control. If she thought she could play me, she was about to learn what real strategy looked like. 2 hours later, she walked out first. She looked around like she was checking for someone. Not paranoid, just cautious. Then he followed. No physical contact, no lingering goodbyes, too smart for that. But I saw the way she adjusted her hair, the way he straightened his cufflinks. Subtle, calculated, deliberate. I waited until they both left before I got out of my truck and walked inside. The hotel lobby smelled like overpriced cologne and bad decisions. I approached the front desk, pulled out my wallet, and flashed a $100 bill. I need to know which room Daniel Roth stayed in today. The clerk, a young guy barely in his 20s, had the bill before glancing around. We don't usually give out that information. I slid another 100 onto the counter. Not asking for a key. Just a number. He swallowed, then tapped something into his computer. Room 815, he muttered. I picked up the bills and tucked them back into my wallet. You've been helpful. Then I turned and walked out, already planning my next move. Back at home, Lorraine was making dinner when I walked in. Something fancy, pasta with some kind of creamy sauce, a bottle of wine already open. She turned, smiled like nothing had changed. Thought I'd cook tonight, she said. Felt like we haven't had a nice dinner in a while. I took in the whole picture, the perfect meal, the forced ease in her voice, the way she held the wine glass just a little too steady. She was playing her role well, but she didn't realize I had already read the script. I sat down at the table, poured myself a glass. Appreciate it, I said, watching her carefully. Long day? She shrugged. Same as always. Meetings, phone calls, the usual. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching her reaction as I spoke. You were downtown today, right? Saw your car near the Hilton. For the briefest second, something flickered across her face. A flash of tension, gone as quickly as it appeared. Oh, yeah. Lunch meeting. Work thing. I nodded slowly, taking a sip. Funny. Thought you said you had an early meeting this morning. There it was. A hesitation. A slight shift in posture. She smiled, but it was too controlled. I did. Back-to-back meetings all day. She was good. Not good enough. I let the conversation drift to other things, let her think she was safe. But in my mind, I was already setting the next trap. I didn't believe in knee-jerk reactions. That's how men lost wars. No, I was going to handle this my way. Methodically. Precisely. Because when I struck, there wouldn't be a way back. The next morning, I was up before her. I sat at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee, scrolling through the data I had collected, GPS logs, financial records, timestamps. Patterns had formed, habits exposed. She thought she was careful. She wasn't. Lorraine walked in, hair still damp from the shower, robe tied neatly around her waist. She barely glanced at me as she moved toward the coffee maker. You're up early. Had some things to go over. I kept my voice even casual. She poured her coffee, stirring it with a slow, deliberate motion. Anything urgent? Not really. I set my phone down, met her eyes. What about you? Another full schedule today. She hesitated for half a second before answering. Yeah, same as usual. I let that sit between us, let her wonder if I was pushing or just making conversation. Then I nodded, went back to my phone. She lingered for a moment before leaving the kitchen. I knew where she was going, knew exactly what her morning routine looked like now. I waited until I heard the shower running before making my next move. Walked into the garage, found her car. I'd been moving it to random locations for days now, just enough to make her second-guess herself. Today, I added another layer. I pulled a spare key fob from my desk drawer and reprogrammed it. A simple trick, but effective. Now I had control of her car, whenever I wanted. She left at exactly 8:15. I watched from the window as she pulled out, waiting until she was a few blocks away before tracking her route. Downtown, just like before. The same hotel. I had enough proof to end this now, but that wasn't the point. The point was control. At the office, I called Reese in. He shut the door behind him, arms crossed. What's going on? I leaned back in my chair. Need some background on a guy. Daniel Roth. Richmond-based investor. Get me everything. Reese didn't ask why. How deep you want me to go? I glanced at the file on my desk, the copies of hotel logs, receipts, screenshots of texts I'd intercepted. Deep enough to hurt him. Reese nodded once. I'll have it by the end of the day. By noon, Lorraine's car was still parked in the hotel lot. I could have walked in, confronted them on the spot, made a scene. That's what weaker men did. Instead, I picked up my phone and made a quiet call to a contact at the local news station. You ever look into that financial fraud tip I sent you? I asked. There was a pause, then a cautious, still digging. Might be worth checking Roth's connections again. I kept my tone light, like I was just making conversation. I've got reason to believe there's more to the story. The reporter hesitated, then said, I'll look into it. I ended the call and watched the hotel entrance. Lorraine and Roth walked out separately, 5 minutes apart. They thought they were being careful. They weren't. That evening, I moved her car again. Not far, just enough to see if she'd notice. When she got home, I was in the garage, wiping down my rifle, keeping my hands busy. She walked in, stopped short when she saw me. Something wrong? I asked, not looking up. She shifted her weight, glancing at her car. I thought I parked closer to the mailbox this morning. I set the cloth down, stood up. Did you? She frowned, shaking her head. I guess I'm just tired. I walked past her, grabbed a beer from the fridge. Long day? She hesitated. Yeah. I popped the cap, took a sip. Anything interesting? Her eyes flickered, just for a second. No. Just the usual meetings. I nodded slowly. Of course. She stood there a little too long, like she was waiting for me to press. I didn't. Let her sit in it. Let her wonder. Because when the time came, she wouldn't see me coming. The next morning, Lorraine was quieter than usual. She moved around the kitchen with precision, pouring her coffee, checking her phone, barely glancing in my direction. I sipped mine slowly, watching. I didn't need to say anything, she was already unraveling. Any plans today? She asked without looking up. Meetings, I said. You. The usual. She took a sip, set the mug down carefully. Might grab lunch with a friend. I nodded. Anyone I know? Her fingers tightened around the handle for just a second before she forced a casual shrug. Doubt it. Just someone from work. I let that sit, let the silence work for me. People rush to fill silence when they're nervous. She didn't. She was too controlled for that. But I saw the way her breathing changed, how she adjusted her posture. She was waiting for me to push. I didn't. At 8:10, she left, like clockwork. I waited a few minutes, then checked the tracker. Straight downtown. Same hotel. No surprises. But today was different. Today, I had everything in place. I made a call. Got it all. Reese's voice came through steady. Bank records, business deals, background. Roth isn't just stepping out with your wife. He's got dirt all over him. Funneling investor money into personal projects, some under-the-table real estate moves, and there's a lawsuit against one of his companies that hasn't gone public yet. He's hanging by a thread. I glanced at my watch. Good. Send it to the right people. Already done. A pause. You sure you don't want this to get messy, eh? I smirked. Reese had known me long enough to know I didn't do messy. I did precise. This will be enough. By noon, my phone buzzed with an alert. I opened the news site and scrolled. The article was up, nothing directly connecting Roth to fraud yet, but enough questions raised to start an avalanche. The comments section was already lighting up with speculation. By the end of the day, his investors would be panicking. His name would be poison in the business world by the end of the week. At 12:45, I parked near the hotel and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Lorraine walked out first, moving fast, shoulders tense. She wasn't looking around this time, she was focused on her phone, typing furiously. Roth followed a few minutes later, and even from a distance, I could see the shift in his demeanor. He looked rattled. I didn't blame him. I gave him a head start before heading home. Lorraine's car was already in the driveway when I pulled up. I walked in to find her pacing in the living room, phone in hand. She looked up, startled, like she hadn't heard me come in. Something wrong? I asked, dropping my keys on the counter. She forced a tight smile. No, just a stressful day. I leaned against the counter, watching her. Anything I can help with? She shook her head too quickly. No, just work stuff. I nodded slowly, then reached for a beer. You hear about Roth? The way she froze told me everything I needed to know. What about him? She asked carefully. I took a sip, met her eyes. Looks like he's in some trouble. Business dealings, fraud allegations. It's all over the news. She exhaled, tried to play it cool. I'm sure it's nothing. Just rumors. I smiled. Maybe. She turned away, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She was unraveling faster now. I'd built my career on watching people, reading their tells. She was losing the battle, and she knew it. I let the night play out like normal. Ate dinner, watched the news, let her sit in her own silence. She barely touched her food. Her phone buzzed a few times, but she didn't pick it up. She was waiting for me to leave the room. I didn't. When I finally stood up, stretched, and grabbed another beer, I saw the relief flicker across her face. She picked up her phone the second I stepped into the kitchen. I walked past her toward the garage, going for a drive. She nodded, distracted. Okay. I stepped out, got in my truck, and drove 3 blocks before circling back. Parked a few houses down, turned off the engine, and waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then the glow of her phone screen lit up the window. She was making a call. I already knew who it was. I let her have it. Let her think she still had a move to play. Because when I made mine, there wouldn't be a damn thing left for her to salvage. By morning, the fallout had started. Roth's name was spreading through the news like a brush fire, and investors were already pulling out. A few strategic leaks ensured the heat wouldn't die down anytime soon. He was going to spend the next few months trying to put out fires, but I wasn't done yet. Lorraine sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, scrolling through the news. She wasn't eating, wasn't even drinking her coffee, just reading. Her foot tapped against the tile, a small, nervous habit she didn't realize she had. She was in damage control mode, waiting for a call that hadn't come yet. I watched her for a moment, then sat across from her, taking my time pouring a cup of coffee. Something interesting? I asked. She barely glanced up. Just reading the news. I sipped my coffee, nodded toward her phone. Roth. Her fingers tightened around the device. It's nothing. Just business stuff. I leaned back in my chair, watching her. She was trying to stay composed, but I knew that look. It was the look of someone realizing the walls were closing in. You should call him, I said casually. Her head snapped up. What? I gestured toward her phone. If you're worried, call him. See how he's holding up? Her jaw tightened. I don't know why you'd say that. I held her gaze for a long moment, then shrugged. Just making conversation. I stood, grabbed my keys. Heading out. Got some meetings. She didn't ask where. She was too busy staring at her phone, debating whether to dial. By the time I reached my office, Reese was already waiting. He dropped a thick folder on my desk and sat down across from me. He's drowning, he said. Investors are pulling out. He's got lawyers lined up trying to get ahead of it, but it's not looking good. I flipped through the file. And Lorraine. She's been trying to reach him. He's not answering. I smirked. Smart man. Reese stretched, cracking his knuckles. What's next? I closed the file, tapped my fingers against the desk. We let it play out a little longer. Let her sweat. Then we moved to the next phase. Reese nodded. And the next phase is? I looked up at him. We make sure she loses everything. That evening, I walked through the door just as Lorraine ended a call. She looked up, startled, like she'd been caught. I took my time hanging my keys, watching her. Long day? I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. I walked to the fridge, grabbed a beer. You eat yet? She shook her head. Not hungry. I sat down, took a slow sip. You hear from Roth? Her eyes darted to mine. No. Why would I? I tilted my head slightly, let the silence stretch. She fidgeted, ran a hand through her hair. It's funny, I said. A week ago, you couldn't put your phone down. Now, suddenly, you don't have much to say. Her face hardened. I don't know what you're trying to imply, but I'm not implying anything. I leaned forward. I'm telling you. I know. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The color drained from her face. I took another sip, set the bottle down with a quiet clink. I know about the hotel, the phone calls, the lunches. I know everything. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold my gaze. Dina. I held up a hand. Don't insult me by lying. She shut her mouth, gripping the edge of the table like she needed to ground herself. I stood, slow and controlled. I'm going to make this real simple for you. You're done. I've already moved the assets. The accounts you thought were yours? They're not. The house? Selling it. Your reputation. I let out a short breath, almost a laugh. That's about to go the way of Roth's career. She blinked, trying to process. What did you do? I picked up my beer, took another sip. I made sure you don't get to walk away clean. She shook her head, standing now, palms flat on the table. This is insane. You can't just. I can. I cut in. And I did. Her breathing was shallow now, panic creeping in. She knew me well enough to know I wasn't bluffing. She opened her mouth, then closed it, exhaling sharply. You really want to do this? After everything? I tilted my head. You should have thought about that before you bet against me. She stood there for a long time, gripping the table, staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time. I didn't move. I'd already won. She just hadn't realized it yet. Lorraine didn't sleep that night. I could hear her pacing in the hallway, could picture her sitting on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, scrolling through the damage, trying to figure out how deep it went. She wouldn't ask me. Not yet. She was still hoping there was a way out. By morning, she looked like hell. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back hastily, movements tight and controlled. She didn't look at me as she poured her coffee. Her hands were steady, but I knew she was coming apart. I sat at the table, drinking mine. You should eat something. She ignored me, staring into her mug like it had answers. You didn't have to do this. I took a sip. Yeah, I did. She swallowed hard, set the mug down. Dean, I held up a hand. Don't. There's nothing you can say that changes anything. She clenched her jaw, breathing slow and controlled, like she was holding something in. I let the silence stretch, let her sit in it. People like Lorraine, people who think they can control every move, they don't handle losing well. She was looking for a way to regain ground, but there wasn't any left. Finally, she exhaled sharply, straightened. I'll get a lawyer. I nodded. You should. She hesitated, probably expecting more anger, some last attempt to salvage something. But there was nothing left to salvage. I stood, grabbed my keys. House is getting listed next week. You should figure out where you're going. Her lips pressed together. You're really enjoying this, aren't you? I met her eyes. No, but I'm not losing sleep over it either. I left her standing there, gripping the counter, staring at nothing. By noon, my lawyer called. She's trying to negotiate. I smirked. Of course she is. She wants to keep the house. Says she'll walk away from spousal support. She's not keeping the house, I said flatly. Sell it. The lawyer sighed. I figured you'd say that. She's not happy. She doesn't have to be. I hung up and leaned back in my chair, watching the city skyline through my office window. Lorraine had played her hand, and she'd lost. Now she was scrambling, trying to salvage whatever she could. It was almost sad. Almost. Reese walked in, dropping a file on my desk. Roth's out. His investors bailed. He's finished. I flipped the folder open, scanning the details. Bankruptcy filings, termination notices, a lawsuit in progress. It was over. I closed the file and smirked. Good. Reese leaned back in his chair. And Lorraine? I shrugged. She'll land somewhere. Just not with me. He nodded, drumming his fingers against the desk. You done? I considered that for a moment. The damage was done. The cheaters had lost, and I hadn't needed to lift a finger in anger. Everything had played out exactly the way I wanted. I exhaled slowly. Yeah, I'm done. That night, I sat on the back porch with a beer, watching the sky fade from orange to deep blue. Lorraine stayed in the house, making phone calls, trying to secure some kind of foothold. She was grasping at nothing, and she knew it. Eventually, she stepped outside, arms crossed. She stood there for a moment, then sighed. So that's it. I took a slow sip, watching the horizon. Yeah, that's it. She hesitated, then nodded, like she'd finally accepted it. She turned and walked back inside, leaving me with nothing but the quiet night air. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was just free. A month later, the house was empty. Movers had cleared the last of the furniture that morning, and now it was just walls, hardwood floors, and silence. I stood in the doorway, scanning the place one last time. It was never really a home, just a structure we occupied while everything rotted underneath. Now it was someone else's problem. Lorraine had taken a rental on the other side of town. Small place, nothing close to what she was used to. The sale of the house went through faster than she expected, and the money? Well, let's just say my lawyer made sure the settlement leaned in my favor. No alimony, no parting gifts, just a clean exit. She tried to fight it for a while, but the moment she realized she didn't have leverage, she folded. Roth had it worse. His company was in freefall, his name tied to too many bad investments and one too many scandals. He'd been forced out of his own firm, abandoned by the same people he tried to impress. His wife had filed for divorce, taking a chunk of his assets with her. Last I heard, he was liquidating whatever he had left to cover his legal fees. Couldn't have happened to a better man. I stepped outside, locked the door, and tossed the keys to the realtor waiting on the porch. It's all yours. She smiled. Not even a little sentimental? I shook my head. It's just a house. I got in my truck and drove without looking back. A week later, I was sitting across from Roth's now ex-wife, Claire, in a quiet restaurant just outside of town. She had a look I'd seen before, the kind of calm that comes after surviving a storm. I have to say, Dean, she said, stirring her drink, you really did a number on them. I smirked. They did it to themselves. I just made sure they felt it. She leaned back, studying me. I never liked your wife. I took a sip of my whiskey. That makes two of us. She laughed, shaking her head. Well, you're a free man now. What's next? I exhaled, staring at the amber liquid in my glass. Not sure. But whatever it is, I'll be calling the shots. She raised her glass. To that. We clinked glasses, and for the first time in a long time, I felt it. Real, unshakable freedom. I wasn't starting over. I wasn't rebuilding. I was moving forward, exactly the way I wanted. And I wasn't looking back.